This is a reading from London Calling, which is the second Mirabelle Bevan mystery, and it's a little part where Vesta, Mirabelle's sidekick, her closest childhood friend, has died and she's going home. And it's from chapter 14, Home is Birthplace, Ratified by Memory. Most of the houses in the area where Vesta was born were rented from the local council. The rest were owned by a few landlords with large portfolios and little inclination to effect repairs. Nothing much had changed in this part of town for 100 years, apart from the sites cleared by the bombing. Rebuilding had started, but it was haphazard, and although 1 or 2 modern blocks of flats had been erected, the majority of the houses were soot-smudged Victorian brick 2-up 2-downs with chipped doors and peeling window frames. Here in the East End, the poorest families eked out a squalid existence jammed up against each other, many of them crowded into tiny bedsits with no electricity. Lines of residential streets clustered round the docks away from the water. The shoreline was reserved for small factories, dockyards and bonded warehouses. It felt heavy here, and the lack of green space always depressed Vesta. It especially dispirited her that rather than being cultivated with vegetables or flowers, the bomb sites had descended into sludgy makeshift playgrounds for the local kids. Vesta couldn't remember finding the place so grey and drab when she was growing up here. Now her return was muted by the feeling that life in the East End was drained of colour, with its grey houses, muddy gap sites, and the ship-brown river that ran through it all. Yet the same could not be said for the people. The rows of local shops teemed with life, and like all areas where people lived and worked together, everyone seemed to know each other. Children of all ages played on the pavements. At this time of year they were wearing home-knitted sweaters in vibrant colours. A little girl with an orange cardigan reminded Vesta of a bright flower in the mud. Women did their shopping on the street where they lived. The menfolk worked in one capacity or another for a handful of employers, or else they ran local businesses, small shops that provided foodstuffs and other necessities. The local pubs were the hub of the community as much as the churches. Messages could be left and parcels picked up in either place. As the castellated outline of Bermondsey Library came into view, Vesta automatically thought, 8 minutes to go. Her mother always said that when you passed Bermondsey Library, that was the time to make sure your coat was done up and to take a deep breath in. Bermondsey housed Biscuit City, the Peak Friens factory, and for miles the air smelled of baking butter biscuits. Sure enough, Vesta checked her coat, breathed in deeply, and 8 minutes later she got off the tram. The smog was so thick she could make out the chime of the bell on the corner shop door more clearly than she could make out the shop itself. The smell of freshly baked rolls wafted towards her, and a paper boy with a large bag slung over his shoulder trudged along the pavement weighed down by his deliveries. It was still early. If she hurried, she'd catch her mother before she left for church. Vesta knew her way without having to see the street signs. Normally she dreaded going home. Her family loved her and the Churchills were close, but sometimes they could be smothering. Much to her parents' consternation, Vesta's older brother had returned to the West Indies. At least he wasn't gawped at in the street, he'd said, and it took a week before news of what he'd been up to could reach his mother, and a week more before she could voice her objections. Vesta liked London, but there'd come a point where she couldn't stay at home. The preferred option for most girls was to get married, of course. Vesta told herself she'd probably do that sometime, but she wasn't quite ready, and besides she had Olympic typing speeds. They joked during the London Games that if only there was a typing event, Vesta would get the gold. The lights in the front room were off, but the pane over the Churchills' front door glowed like a beacon. There was no need to knock. Like most houses round here, the large tarnished key sitting in the inside lock was rarely used. "It's me," she called. "Lord Almighty, Vesta," came the cry from the kitchen, and all 14 stones of Mrs. Churchill bustled down the hallway. She wrapped her arms tightly round her daughter. Vesta couldn't help but burst into tears. Her mother's soft skin smelled of soap and coconut oil, and her arms were strong. The yellow floral housecoat was comforting in its familiarity. Vesta sobbed, unable to restrain herself. "It's Lyndon, Mama. He's dead."